The U-sets, the first generation of electric interurban trains in New South Wales. These formed the backbone of interurban travel out of Sydney from 1958 until they were retired in 1996. While not as well discussed as later trains, they set the stage for my beloved V-sets and the more recent Oscars and NIFs. The history of the U-sets starts with the main Western Line, originally built in stages starting in the 1860s through to the 1870s. And like many lines that go through mountains, it was steep, which trains tend not to like. So the engineers back in the day looked for ways to get around this. The original method, and arguably the most famous, is the zigzag railway, where the trains double back on themselves to reduce the grade. This was later replaced by the 10 tunnels deviation in 1910, bypassing the slower zigzag and allowing for larger, heavier trains. And to haul these larger trains, they built stuff like this, the D57 class, which, while not being the most powerful steam locomotives in Australia, that title goes to the AD60 class, the D57s have the highest tractive effort. However, the problem with steam locomotives this large is that they're hungry for fuel and maintenance nightmares. So as soon as an alternative became available, the railways started looking into it. After the turn of the century, electrified railway lines started to become common, especially in Europe and the United States, and they proved especially adept in mountainous areas. As you can probably guess, the railway started pursuing it, with one of the earliest suggestions coming in John Bradfield's 1916 report, where he said it may be viable to electrify as far as Bathurst, but doing so would have to wait as suburban electrification took priority. By 1937, another report will recommend electrification as far as Wallerawang, amongst other recommendations for electrification at Goulburn, Port Kembla and Newcastle, with the goal of having it complete by the 1950s. Obviously, that never happened. I've yet to find a reason stated anywhere, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say World War II played a factor. Thankfully, once the war was over, the government expected coal traffic from new mines around Wallerawang to increase dramatically. So in 1949, it was decided to electrify the line from the then terminus of electrification, Parramatta, to Penrith and then on to Wallerawang. For freight and passenger traffic going beyond the electrified network, this would be handled by 40 new mixed traffic 46 class electric locomotives, built by Metropolitan Vickers and Bayer Peacock in the United Kingdom. While for passenger traffic between Penrith and Wallerawang, they ordered the U-sets. The 1952 U-set order consisted of 35 first class motor cars, 35 second class motor cars, 35 second class trailers, and 35 second class buffet trailer cars for 140 cars total. And they were made of painted carbon steel, similar to the Sputnik fleet, delivered around the same time. Also like the Sputniks, these were made into 4 car sets with 2 motor cars sandwiching 2 trailers, with one being a buffet car. However, by 1953, the projected increase in coal traffic never materialised, so electrification was cut back to Bowenfells, and since there would be a reduced need for trains, the U-set order was cut back to 20 first class motor cars, 20 second class motor cars, 20 second class trailers, and 20 second class buffet trailers. In 1954, this was awarded to Commonwealth Engineering at Granville. One of the main reasons they were able to beat out other bidders, such as Clyde Engineering and AE Goodwin, was their prior experience with welded construction of coaches. These are much stronger and cheaper than riveting, which other manufacturers relied on. If you want to see the difference, compare the Tulloch suburban cars, which were riveted, and the Sputniks, which were welded. Comenge also planned to win by forming a consortium with Gloucester Carriage and Wagon in the United Kingdom, who most famously built the bodies of the Harris trains in Melbourne, and the legendary Budd in the United States, the latter of which pioneered fluted stainless steel for railway applications, in which the stainless steel reduced corrosion, thereby extending the service life of the cars to basically the end of time, while the fluting provided structural rigidity, allowing less material to be used for the same amount of strength, thereby also reducing weight. However, as mentioned before, the early order for 140 cars was dissolved, but was later replaced by the small order of 80 cars in 1953, at which point Gloucester Carriage Wagon had lost interest. However, Budd and Comenge still chose to work together and, in the end, won the contract. Now for Comenge, the goal was to build the trains, obviously, although the government didn't make this easy. In 1955, the American firm Basco Services Incorporated was commissioned to consult on the modernising of the state's railways, and one of the recommendations was a removal of buffet services from the USET fleet, which was accepted. The buffet cars originally were going to be numbered RT 6601 to 6620. However, these were changed to first class cars numbered ETB 6021 to 6040. And as they were now first class cars, all the motor cars became second class and were coded CF 5001 to 5040. And the existing trailers became TF 6001 to 6020. What also complicated matters was the Department of Railways was in dire financial straits, of which the 1955 to 1956 financial year would be their worst on record to that date, with a deficit of £7.6 million, which resulted in delays to all outstanding contracts. This, combined with the federal government, who owned a large portion of Comenge at the time, being unable to decide on what it would do with the shares of the company that it owned, also made it difficult for Comenge management to plan the future of the company. But it also doesn't end there. The railways weren't sure if they wanted to go with stainless steel, which was more expensive to purchase, or carbon steel, which was more expensive to maintain. For comparison, the Spunding order made at the same time was for trains made of carbon steel, and it comprised of 40 motor cars and 40 trailers, the same amount as the USET order. Yet it only cost £847,975, while the USETs would have cost £1.46 million, nearly twice as much, which for a cash-strapped railway is a decent difference. But in the end, Comenge managed to convince the railways of the benefits of stainless steel, so the cars finally began construction, only for the railways to dilly-dally with deciding what to do with electrical wiring and braking systems, which was annoying for Comenge, as this meant that shells were rolling off the production line at a rate of 2 per week to start with, and then 1 per week later on, only to go into storage. You can't finish the cars if you don't know what the electrical systems or braking systems will look like. This got so bad that shells ended up being taken to Eunora for storage as they ran into space at Granville. Eventually, the railways got their affairs in order and just let Comenge take care of the electrical and braking systems themselves. So, as time went on, the cars got built and finally they were ready to make their way onto the rails. On the 22nd of June 1957, these new cars had their debut, with cars TF 6006 to 6009 making their way to Lithgow, sandwiched between 4612 at the head end and a power van coded CHO 2007 taking up the rear. Apart from being the first outing of the USETs, this was also the first service to operate on the newly opened electrification of the Blue Mountains line. Their debut under their own power came on the 15th of September 1958, when a 9-car train made up the 508M, the Fish service, to Sydney Central from Lithgow. I want to take a quick detour to talk about the Fish. So if you don't know, the Fish is, as I said before, an early morning train between Lithgow and Sydney. Allegedly, it got this name because one of the drivers back in the 1860s to 1880s was named John Heron, and his nickname was the Big Fish. I'm presuming for obvious reasons. This, combined with John Heron's son, a driver named David Heron, and a fireman named John Salmon, all working with a guard called John Pike, led the train to be called the Fish. So when they wanted to add a second train to complement it, this time starting at Springwood, they of course had to name it the Chips, as after all, fish and chips do go pretty well together. By the time our USETs came into service, they wanted to add a new train on, this time starting at Emu Plains, but what to call it? Well, the local Chamber of Commerce asked people to write in, and they came up with some pretty funny ones. My favourite are the flathead, the salt, the bread, the butter, the Penrith crab, the fillet, the lemon, the spud, the scallop, the pepper and the salt, the greyfin, the bones, and the spev. The last one I love, because according to the person suggesting it, SPEV stood for Sydney, Penrith, Emu Plains and Valley Heights, which is a great name for a train that doesn't go to Valley Heights. In the end, the new train became the Heron, named after the original John Heron that the Fish was named after. So, while this is cool, I have an ulterior motive for bringing this up. Sometime in 2017, Transport New South Wales stopped referring to the Fish and Chips on timetables, and I believe we should bring them back. In fact, I would argue we should name every single Blue Mountains line service. Apart from what I've mentioned here, may I also suggest the hamburger, or about the pineapple fritter. And if we want to be inclusive, we could also add the kebab, or the halal snack pack, or the spring roll, or the banh mi. Transport New South Wales, if you want to talk, my DMs are open. So now that we've discussed lunch, by 1958, when the trains ended service, they proved popular. Their sleek stainless steel bodies and smooth and quiet ride proved far superior to the old wooden coaches behind steam locomotives they replaced. However, there was one group that didn't enjoy this so much. Those aforementioned wooden coaches were compartment coaches, unlike the newer U-sets, which were open coaches. This change annoyed some people, as the U-sets coming in saw mandatory reserve seating go, and the compartment coach design made organising clubs easier. So for instance, people who lived at Lithgow or commuted to Sydney on the Fish would often get their mates together, reserve an entire compartment, and play cards, chess, backgammon, or whatever together. But with the U-sets, reservations were optional and could only be obtained with an extra fee, so only wealthier travellers could afford to continue this practice. People who couldn't afford the cost often just ended up doing their part to reserve seats for their mates. Okay, so back to the trains themselves. As mentioned prior, for their first service, they operated as a 9-car set. However, for Fish services going forward, they would work as 10-car sets. For most other services, they would work as either 4 or 8-car trains. In terms of the electrical equipment, they were basically the same as the Sputniks, using the same single-pan diamond pantograph, connected to the same 165 horsepower Metropolitan Vickers MV22 motors, mounted on each axle of the motor car. This in turn was controlled by the same electro-pneumatic stepped resistor control system, and yes, if you're curious, I did ask, and apparently the Sputniks and U-sets were electrically compatible. However, I do not have any record of them working together at any point. In service, they did have some issues, one being that their speed limit was 70 miles per hour, or 113 kilometers per hour, which, to be fair, wasn't an issue. It's more that the crew didn't exactly respect it. Back in the day, it wasn't uncommon to see U-sets gunning it past Blacktown. Part of it is to be blamed on the trains not having speedometers, which, surprisingly, was fairly typical for the time. Not to say crew didn't have any way of telling how fast they were going. The official way was a combination of mileposts and route knowledge, so the time between passing milepost 50 and 51 was around a minute. You know you were going about 70 miles per hour. And for the most part, drivers just had to know. But there was another less official way. In a Railway Digest article from 1996 by Ron Preston, he tells the story of a driver who said the way he could tell how fast he was going was by the wind hitting the hatch covering the leading traction motor. If it is lifting up, you're doing about 65. If it's open, you're doing about 70. And if it's floating, you're going a lot faster than that, which... The other issue they had was the suspension was not the best. It was still typical coil spring, which is fairly common at the time, and with the crew gunning it, they tended to bounce a lot, to the point they got the nickname trampoline cars, because they'd hit a bump, and then bounce, and bounce, and bounce, and they wouldn't stop. However, this was fairly quickly remedied by installing additional dampeners, and while there still had a tendency to roleplay as kangaroos, it wasn't as bad. While that's quite fun, I do want to talk about probably their most interesting aspect. Occasionally, if needed, they'd attach an IHO brake van, not for slowing down the train, but to carry parcels. I'm not aware of when this practice ended, but it seems to have been somewhat rare in the 1960s, and after that, I can't find any record of it being a thing. Either way, it's an interesting little tidbit. And speaking of the 1960s, by January 1960, electrification had reached all the way north to Gosford, which was electrified after recommendation by our old mates at Abasco in the same report that cut the buffet cars. As the U-sets were still the pride of the interurban fleet, the first electric train to Gosford was one, and it had the distinction of carrying the then Premier, Bob Heffron. Once things had settled in, by 1962, 3 8-car sets were remarshalled into 6-car sets to allow an additional service to Mount Victoria and Gosford in the evening. This also allowed the creation of 10-car sets by combining a 6 and a 4-car set. These were then used on the fish and chip service as mentioned prior, as well as for additional services on the Northern Line to Gosford. Interestingly enough, after Gosford, you'd assume the next place they'd work would be Wyong, as that was the next big electrification project. But no, oddly enough, they started to work to Canberra and Goulburn in 1961. Okay, I should maybe be a bit more specific. So in 1961, Comeng was building the 1100 class rail motors, which are basically just Budd RDCs, albeit modified for New South Wales' slightly smaller loading gauge. Uniquely, this fleet was consist of 4 powered cars and 1 trailer, making them the only unpowered Budd RDCs that came like that from the factory. But back on topic, the issue was that they needed the 1100 class cars in service ASAP, as this was when country services were a lot more important than they are today. Yet, they only had 2 powered cars. So, they converted a U-set trailer car, sandwiched it between 2 1100 class rail motors, and had it work the Canberra-Monaro Express, and then the Goulburn Day train. Apparently on one of these services, the Goulburn train was delayed, and because it's a USET car I guess, a ComEng engineer egged the driver on to see how fast he'd go. The answer? 94 miles per hour, or 151 kilometers per hour. Apparently in the 1100s, it was thrilling, but the ComEng engineer said in the USET trailer, it was terrifying. Once the rest of the 1100 class rail cars were delivered, they then went to work the South Coast Daylight Express, as originally intended, and the USET car went back to the interurban network. By the late 1960s, double-deck electric multiple units began to appear on the suburban network in the form of the Tulloch double-deck trailers and motor car prototypes, which proved, as a suburban train, the concept of a fully double-deck train was viable. In that same year, the Department of Railways went back to ComEng and ordered a new double-deck interurban, which, while originally targeted as USETs and technically FSETs, long story, these eventually became what we know as the VSETs, which, of course, I will discuss in greater detail in a future video. However, by 1970, the first batch arrived and began working alongside the USET counterparts. Not long after, in the 70s, the USETs had their sliding windows replaced with aluminium Beckloat windows. I still don't know how to pronounce that. Similar to their counterparts in the suburban fleet, in 1974, one-class travel was introduced. As the 1970s drew to a close, newer VSETs arrived, which mostly worked the northern line, while the USETs kept to the west. In the early 1980s, electrification would be expanded, first reaching Wyong in 1982, Newcastle in 1984, Port Kembla in 1996, and Dapto in 1993. By the late 1980s, a new fleet would be introduced, that being the Tangara, which, while mostly suburban trains, 32 outer suburban G-sets were introduced, which, in combination with the final order of 7 Series 8 V-set trains in 1989, spelled the end of the U-sets. In their final years, they were met with mixed feelings. While train and maintenance crew would seemingly miss them, and some sporting "my other car is a U-boat" stickers to show affection for the aging fleet, others were glad to see them relegated to history books, with quite a few parent groups demanding their retirement ASAP due to them still having manual doors, which meant dumb kids ran the risk of opening the door and then falling out. Either way, the final Western Line USET service was in February 1996, and on the 29th of October, the final scheduled USET service ran between Sydney Terminal and Newcastle. From then, all services would be dead running to move them from storage at Redfern to Flemington and Clyde. Not to say this was the end, as their final use was on the 3rd of November by the Sydney Electric Train Society, who ran their Farewell to U-Boats tour, which was performed by an 8-car set. Since that date, however, unfortunately, no USET has moved under its own power, but that might change. But before I talk about that, I do want to take a quick detour to talk about the USET appearing in media, because for some reason they did that too. Their first appearance was in the 1999 film The Matrix, where one tries to run down Neo and has apparently been given Chicago L-style marker lights for some reason. Still has the City Rail branding though. Another one appeared in Guy Sebastian's music video for Standing With You, which I only know about because it says on Wikipedia. Let me just say it's not my style of music. Okay, so post-retirement, where are the USETs now? Well, quite a few were scrapped unfortunately, but a fair few made it into preservation. We'll start with the sad news. First off, the Richmond Vale Railway Museum. They had cars TF6001, 6002 and ETB 6026, but lost them to a bushfire in 2017. Thankfully, they still have some left, those being TF6008, 6009, 6011, 6012 and 6019, which are currently stored. The aforementioned Sydney Electric Train Society has a few, those being CF 5001, 5003, 5021 and 5022, as well as TF 6010 and ETB 6037. Unfortunately, none of which are on display. However, Valley Heights Museum does have ETB 6039, which is on display. And finally, we have Transport Heritage New South Wales, and technically their sub-brand, Historic Electric Traction, who have cars CF 5015, 5017, 5035, TF 6013 and ETB 6029, which they are planning to restore and make operational once again, which obviously I hope happens. So, to conclude, the U-sets, while not necessarily being a revolution when compared to the V-sets that came after them, they were still solid trains. They did their job well and brought forth a new era of transport in the places they served. While in their later years, like all trains, they were rather righty, they at least looked just as graceful as they did when they were built, thanks to their stainless steel bodies. Hopefully, Transport Heritage is able to get one operational, because I'd love to ride one for myself, and I'm sure lots of people would love to relive the experience of riding a U-boat up the mountains. So to end, I know this has been a long time coming. This script was originally finished in January of 2024, and for a variety of reasons, I've been unable to film it until now, and I also don't have a really good transition. So if you wish to support me making more cool stuff, you can support my Ko-fi. If you do so, you get early access to the scripts I'm working on, and any cool research stuff I find, and you'll be joining the lovely people, including my parents, Building Beautifully, Chris Topher, Z, Luke Norris, Axwalia, Melee, Skipperoo, Aaron Slater, CK, Johnawee, Samantha, Tacit Dionysus, and the Transporters. Their support allows me to pay other people to help make my videos. If this video seems a bit different, it's because it's been edited by my friend Rice. If you've been active on Twitter, Blue Sky, or really any meme page, you've probably encountered them. They're the person who spouts urbanist takes with the possum profile picture. I've pretty much given them full creative control, so if they edit something weird in that blame them, that's their fault. But yes, I'll see you in another video. Hopefully like and subscribe and all those gubbins. I'm gonna go do nothing for a bit, because working and studying full time makes me tired. The flathead, the salt, the bread, the butter, why can't I say that? The Penrith crab, the fillet, the lemon, the spud, the scallop, the pepper and the salt, the greyfin, the bones, and the spev.